Hello, welcome to this session. My name is Catherine Choptunji, and I'm the Executive Director of the African Population and Health Research Center in Nairobi, Kenya. So I was asked to give a case study about implementation research in Africa. And so what I'm going to present is a project that I've been involved in as a principal investigator that involved designing and implementing what we call the scale-up study in Nairobi, Kenya. So what was the scale-up study about? The aim was to reduce mortality from cardiovascular diseases by reducing what we call the leakages from the continuum of care for cardiovascular disease prevention in highly marginalized urban areas in Nairobi, Kenya. And the intent was that if this was successful, then this model that we developed, which was the scale-up model, could be applied to similar settings in sub-Saharan Africa. So what I've presented on the right side of the slide is a picture from the context in which this study was done. When I talk about highly marginalized urban areas, these were actually slum settlements. And the picture shows a small private clinic that is most likely owned by an individual. And the reason that I show this is it's because this is the dominant model of healthcare, of health service delivery in these slum settlements. So it's a very important contextual factor because as slum settlements, most of them are informal, and therefore there are hardly any public health facilities. And so people mostly have to pay out of pocket to access healthcare services. The other contextual factor which was important and that perhaps influenced the outcome of this study is that the most individuals in informal settlements or slum settlements work in the informal sector, and many of them are casual laborers. And so when it comes to income and access to funds and paying out of pocket, there are huge challenges in the context that could influence any kind of intervention you want to do. So the question is why the scale-up study is important. And the first is that the study was done around 2011. And at that time, we had information about the projections from the Global Burden of Disease that showed that cardiovascular disease was the #1 cause of death in sub-Saharan Africa in 2008. And so on the left side of the screen, there's a graphic that shows how the different causes of death are ranked. And I think many of you would be surprised, or maybe not, to see that cardiovascular disease is ahead of HIV/AIDS, is ahead of respiratory infections, diarrheal diseases, and malaria, which we seem to know as the most prominent causes of death in this part of the world. On the right side of the screen is it shows projections, and what is obvious is that projections from 2000 to 2030 show that while the mortality from HIV/AIDS, TB, and malaria, which are like the big three, is going down, the mortality from cardiovascular disease is expected to double, from where it was in 2000 to where it will be in 2030. So cardiovascular disease is important as we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa. And the question is, what is the most important risk factor? And this is another study from around that time that showed that hypertension was the #1 risk factor for cardiovascular disease globally. So on the left side, you still see a graphic that shows how the different risk factors are ranked, and hypertension is right up there, double the number of disability-adjusted life years that are attributable to hypertension compared to things like cholesterol, insufficient intake of fruits and vegetables, and high salt intake, and so on and so forth. Now, the issue with hypertension is that in sub-Saharan Africa, it's even a much more pronounced problem. So on the right side of the screen, you see two maps. And these maps, the top one shows the prevalence of high blood pressure in females, while the lower one shows the raised high blood pressure in males, age 25 and above. And these are age standardized estimates. And I think it's self-explanatory from the map that Africa has the red spots and the mustard spots more than any other country in the world. And so from the legend, this shows that countries which have a very high prevalence of hypertension. So we see that cardiovascular disease is important in sub-Saharan Africa. Hypertension is the most important risk factor, and Africa is particularly hard hit by hypertension. Now, what is the situation on the ground? And maybe one of the lessons from implementation research is that many times, if you're working with decision makers in government, they will hardly make any policy changes or program changes based on data from other parts of the world. Many times they want data that is local. And so we had done a study from 2008, 2011, which we call the NCD Risk Factor Survey. And I'll keep on referring to the NCD Risk Factor Survey or the CVD Risk Factor Survey in my presentation. So this was a cross-sectional survey that targeted adults that are aged 18 years and above in the same place where the scale-up study was done. The NUHDSS is the Nairobi Urban Health and Demographic Surveillance System. It's a longitudinal platform we're able to track individuals who come in, who lives, who dies, who is born. So we actually have a good sense of who is in that particular area where the surveillance system is located. And so from this survey, we selected more than 5,000 participants and did the questionnaire as well as physical measurements. So some very top level results from this study is that hypertension was more than 12%, while diabetes was about 4.5%. Now, the most critical or the most important finding we found from this survey that ultimately shaped our subsequent work in this area was the fact that amongst the people who were diabetic and hypertensive, only less than 20%, it was actually 18% of people were aware that they had this condition, meaning that they had the previous diagnosis. So if you got 100 people with hypertension, only 18 of them had been previously diagnosed. The same with diabetes, meaning that people are walking around with these conditions without knowing that they actually, they're having these underlying conditions. Now, the other findings from this study was that among the people who were aware and had been previously diagnosed, less than 50% had been on treatment for hypertension in the previous year. If you look at the number of people who had been on treatment in the last 2 weeks before the survey, it's even lower than that. So being diagnosed and being on treatment, completely different things. Now, if you looked at those individuals who had been on treatment in the previous year, then you found that only less than 30% had their blood pressure under control, at least during the survey when we did the blood pressure measurements. So this shows you how much of a problem that exists. The prevalence is not very high at 12%, but the fact that there's a very large proportion of people who have an undiagnosed high blood pressure shows you that in terms of cardiovascular risk at the population level, then it's quite high. The other incidental findings with regards to dietary habits, more than 50% of individuals did not have sufficient intake of fruits and vegetables according to WHO standards, while 37% had high salt intake. Now, the other situation on the ground is a different study. Now, the genesis of this study was that since we had been working in this population for quite some time, before we designed the CVD risk factor survey, we were aware of the context of healthcare service provision. So this is not a population where if you go out and measure blood pressure or blood glucose and you find that somebody is hypertensive or diabetic, that you can tell them, go to the nearest health facility for care, because the nearest healthcare facility is a private facility where they have to pay out of pocket. And so we knew that it wouldn't be ethical to go out there, diagnose people and leave them to their own devices. So we made a provision during the risk factor survey that individuals who would be identified during the survey as having raised blood pressure or raised blood glucose, they would be referred to a clinic that we had set up as part of the project. Now, WDF came in, that's the World Diabetes Foundation, came in because we were able to get additional funding to complement the funds we had already received as part of the survey. And so that's why most of the work was done under this WDF project. So for the WDF project, we wanted to provide care for patients that we had been identified during the survey, as I've said, and build the capacity of local private health facilities to provide care to these patients, and then strengthen the capacity of mid-level cadres of healthcare workers. These are nurses and clinical officers, so that they can actually run these clinics that we had established. This was important because at the time we were trying to do this work, the protocols in Kenya did not allow mid-level cadres of healthcare workers to treat conditions like diabetes and high blood pressure. Now, what would happen is when the field workers went out to collect data and they found somebody with raised blood pressure or abnormal blood glucose, they would tell them, you can go to this place on this date because we knew what the clinic dates were, and you'll be taken care of. And then they'll give them referral and directions and then support to make sure that they actually went to the clinic. Now, when we started this, we didn't expect that we would do any kind of analysis, but later we realized that there would be a lot of learning. So the findings we have from this study was based on a retrospective analysis of the clinic attendance records of the individuals who came for care. Now, the results were shocking because, as I've said, this was a free clinic in a very poor area, but we had high dropout rates, more than 87% of the hypertension patients. These are confirmed, not based on the screening. And then the 63% of diabetes patients actually dropped out. And the majority dropped out in the first 6 months, almost 70%. And that was quite shocking that even with the provision of free services, people could still drop out, of this care. And for those that remained, we found a significant decrease of blood pressure to the tune of an average of 16 millimeters of mercury systolic, depending on when they joined the program and when the program ended. Now, the second part of this WDF project was that we felt it would be irresponsible establishing a treatment mechanism for people who had identified during the study. And then after the funding closes from the project, we tell people, we're closing up, we don't have any more money, and you're now on your own. So what we did, we had a transition phase where we decided to put up a mechanism that would ensure that the patients would keep on getting care even after the project had closed. So what we did was to the patients had set up support groups as part of the WDF project. So what we did is support them to formalize these support groups. And what they did, all the support groups came together, and then they formed a community-based organization, which was then registered with the local authorities. Now, the reason for registering this is because we knew that after the project had ended, there needed to be a mechanism through which these patients from very poor communities can continue accessing medication. And the only way they could access medication was to go to the body that is responsible for providing medicine and supplies to private entities in Kenya, and that is called KEMSA. So by registering as a CBO, then they could actually apply and then be allowed to buy medicines and other supplies at wholesale price, as any way that a private hospital or a private clinic would be able to do. So they set up a governance structure, and then the fundamental thing that happened is that they introduced a membership fee that was dependent on diagnosis. So the way it was supposed to work is that if you wanted to benefit from the wholesale prices of this group, you had to pay a monthly fee, and this ranged from $4 to $6. So if you're hypertensive only, you paid $4. If you're diabetic on insulin, you paid about $6. And the collective funding that was being raised from this membership fee was supposed to be pooled and then used to purchase, the bulk drugs on wholesale, but also give an allowance to the healthcare workers that continue to run these clinics. So other than that, we trained expert patients to support the healthcare workers in managing the flow of patients. And then we gave them a seed grant that was used to establish a revolving fund, which would give them some kind of buffer as they are collecting their monthly membership fee. They would have some kind of buffer so that in the end, the money for buying drugs keeps on being replenished and they never run out. And then this was supposed to be self-sustaining in future. So I can't give more details about how that experiment worked out. But then one of the significant results is that there was no further significant dropout after introducing the monthly fees. So it was almost as if there was some kind of self-selection of the individuals who had stayed in the program when it was free. And now the introduction of monthly fees did not have a huge impact in dropout. So how did Scale Up come into the picture? So this was a combination of lessons from the first survey on risk factors, the high rates of undiagnosed, untreated, and uncontrolled blood pressure, and then the learning from the WDF study that free medical treatment was not enough to keep people in care. But looking at the population level, the fact that there was such a huge proportion of undiagnosed individuals and there was such poor retention in care, we wanted to design an intervention that would address what we call the leakages in the continuum of care. And so the aim of Scale Up was to develop, implement, and evaluate a cost-effective model for prevention of cardiovascular disease in slum settings that was supposed to be sustainable and scalable. So the setup phase happened from 2011 to 2012, and then 2012 August, the end of 2013 was the intervention. This was preceded by a baseline, and then recruitment of participants, then delivering the intervention, and then doing an end line around that ended at the end of December. And then between December and July of 2014 was analysis and dissemination. So designing the intervention, our approach was to develop a model that was theoretically cost-effective, based on the evidence from local studies, but also from evidence from other places. And the idea was to incorporate evidence from the literature review about how different interventions can be used to support the continuum of care and what would be the cost. So all this was put together in a single model. And then theoretically, we proposed that if you did X, Y, Z, this is how much you would achieve, and this is how much it would cost with regards to reducing risk at the population level. So what we did is to do some kind of modeling to identify where the most leakage occurred in the continuum of care. Now, when you look at this graphic on the left side, if you assume that there's a pool of individuals in a population that are at risk, and the risk is that they have high blood pressure. Now, most of these people, as we said earlier, don't even know what is high blood pressure. They don't know what are the implications of having high blood pressure. What is the risk with regards to cardiovascular health? Most of these people would not know. So if you did an intervention to try to increase their awareness, and let's say you started with 100 people who are in a risk group, only about 85% of those would be taking up any intervention that would make them aware of the risk of hypertension. So it's not that whatever you do, if you say we're going to do a public event, or that you're going to put on radio, there'll always be a loss with regards to the people at risk and how many of them actually eventually get uptake of interventions that are supposed to increase their awareness about that risk. So if you used the number of people who are aware of the risk because they partook of interventions, and you made them the denominator, then if you made them aware that there's a possibility of screening, only 90% of them would actually show up for screening. So you still lose there's another leakage there, that people being aware that they might have hypertension because of their age, because of their history, because of their lifestyle. Not everybody will still come for screening. So you lose another 10% in that continuum. Now, for those that come to screening, if you find that out of those that come out of screening, that they actually have been diagnosed with risk, meaning that they have elevated blood pressure, you can categorize individuals with elevated high pressure into those that are medium and high risk and those that are low risk. So we are not concerned about the low risk. Let's concern ourselves with the medium risk. So let's say out of the 90 people that showed up, that you have 21 who are at medium or high risk. Now, of those, once you screen them and say you are likely to have a medium or high risk, and you send them for diagnosis and they understand what they need to do, you don't lose a lot there. But when you say go for treatment, you lose about 20% of them. Even after diagnosis and people understanding they have high blood pressure, only 80% of them will seek treatment. Now, if you use that as a denominator and then you go through the whole continuum, okay, now you've gone for treatment, you've been prescribed medication, will you take your first medication? Will you adopt a healthy lifestyle? And will you stay in care? That's where the biggest loss actually happens, because only 65% of individuals who start treatment will stay in long-term care, being compliant. Now, by the time you reach the last bar, which is on the right side of this graphic, having started with 100 people at risk, you realize that by that time, you probably have about 3 who end up having their risk reduced because their blood pressure is controlled. So we wanted to identify where the biggest leakages happen, and we have those 3 red circles, but there's another circle around linking people from being aware of screening and actually going for screening, which is where you lose the 10%. Now, once we identified where these leakages were, the question was, what interventions are there to plug those leakages? So what we did was to do a literature review that would try to identify different interventions that have been used to create awareness about an illness, have been used to create awareness about screening, have been used to get people to get screened, and then once they are screened, linked to care where they can seek treatment, and then keep them, in long-term compliance with treatment. So there wasn't like lots and lots of literature around how to do this for hypertension, but there are lots of literature how to do this for things like HIV. So based on that literature review, we identified different interventions, and then using some kind of stakeholder engagement, we're able to prioritize and say, these are the things that would work in this context to address all the leakages along the continuum of care. So once that was done, the next question was, how do you design a theoretically cost-effective intervention? So for all these four leakage points, looking at the possible interventions that we had defined on the previous slide, we costed that. And then we came up with an estimate of what we'd expect that this kind of package would cost in terms of keeping people in care. That was the main outcome, keeping people in care and then having their blood pressure controlled. So as I've said, since we were in this defined population where we have a demographic surveillance, we could estimate about how many individuals were above the age of 35, because our target was above the age of 35. Those were the target population. So we know that we have about 35,000 individuals. And then we estimated that based on other studies, if you have an awareness campaign based on either community meetings or using religious institutions or radio, you'd only get about 7,000 being aware as a result of those mechanisms. Now, if you did a screening based on door-to-door campaigns, you will not get all the 7,000, you'll get about 6,000. Now, out of those 6,000, you would identify about 5,600 patients who are at high risk. Now, once that was identified, then the next thing was how many of them would seek care. And we had estimated about 1,200 that they would actually seek care. And if you go through along the whole row, the upper part of this graphic, we expected that by the end of the year, we would have about 620 people in care and hopefully with their blood pressure controlled. So that was the first estimate based on this theoretical cost effectiveness model. Now, when it came to the costs per year, in the first 1 year, we expect to spend about $60,000, based on different estimates about what it costs to do a public meeting, to screen individuals, to refer them, to do door-to-door campaigns. We spent about $60,000. And then over 10 years, we expected about $300,000 because once the setup costs had been taken care of in year 1, then the running costs from year 2 to 10 were lower. So once we had this model, then we are ready to go out and start implementing it. So I won't go into the details of all the implementation, but I'll just give some of the findings, like where did we start and where did we end? So as I said, where we started was this theoretical model that would spend about $60,000 to keep about 620 patients in care in this population. And at over 10 years, we spend about $300,000. Now, the conclusion from this theoretical cost effectiveness analysis was that if the results of the implementation are in line with the theoretical projections, then the scale up of this service delivery package could be extended to other poor urban areas in Kenya by relevant policymakers and NGOs. It wasn't too expensive, like $20,000 to keep 600 people in care didn't seem, like something which was beyond the reach of, NGOs. And then in time, this approach may prove to be sustainable and scalable elsewhere in Africa. So that was the conclusion before we went out into the field. Now, what happened when we went up into the field? Things didn't work out as we expected. So I have two main findings. One is the summary of costs per unit outcome at each stage of the community-based intervention. And then the other one is the conclusion from the impact evaluation. So the number of people reached was less. We expected about 7,500 that we would reach from all these interventions, but we only reached 4,000. When it came to the people who were referred for treatment, there were about 660. And people who stayed in care, 178. And then people whose blood pressure was controlled, slightly less than 60. The costs were much higher than we anticipated. Part of it, of course, were the project management costs. But in addition, we had to invest in setup costs for the clinics that we are going to work with. Furniture, sprucing up the room so they look nice, buying equipment and all that. So the cost of setup were much higher than we had anticipated in the theoretical model. And so if you look at the last column, that the cost per person was much higher than we expected. So $17 for awareness and screening, about $120 for linking people to treatment, and then about $200 for retaining them in care, and more than $3,000 for having one person's blood pressure controlled. So this was, of course, much higher than we expected. But when we tried to contextualize this, we found that in actual fact, the treatment costs of somebody, let's say, who is on HIV treatment, ARTs, or somebody who is on TB treatment is actually higher than this. And so in putting this into the context of other important healthcare conditions in the same population, that this is not as expensive as those conditions. Now, when you looked at the impact evaluation, we found that although an effect attributable to this intervention could not be detected, we found reductions in blood pressure in both the intervention group and the control groups at the population level, as well as among participants who were enrolled in this study with hypertension. So this was an interesting finding. And part of the reason is that the center has been doing research in both control and intervention communities. And so it was very hard to disconnect and say, we've done a survey, we found you guys there's high blood pressure, but now your control, you cannot partake of any intervention that is going to happen, because there was contamination by design, because the center is working in both communities, and the communities are about 10 kilometers apart. But during various interactions, the community health workers in the control community were able to know what was going on. The healthcare workers were able to know. So they started initiatives that were replicating what was being done in the intervention group. So much as contamination happened, it was good contamination because we saw reductions in both areas. But of course, from the science perspective, we are not able to detect the significant differences that we expected to detect. So if I was to put what we did into a framework, we started with formative research, understanding what was happening on the ground, evidence synthesis from other settings that helped us to understand what kind of interventions and what would be the potential cost and what would be the potential impact on the leakages in the continuum of care. And then we didn't just build on the scientific evidence, but also from the process learning for us before we designed the intervention. Because from the WDF project, we had seen some learning from the process that sort of prompted us to be a little bit more scientific in doing the analysis. And from there, we're able to propose an intervention that would plug those leakages we had observed, both from the observational study, but also from the operations research. So it's some kind of progression from observation to operations, and then now this quasi-experimental design that helped us to see what is the potential impact of the package we had designed. But other than that, in terms of process, we had to establish very strong multi-stakeholder partnerships. We had academic partners from Amsterdam and the Boston Consulting Group, which helped us with these models and the theoretical cost effectiveness. And then, of course, the Ministry of Health, because this was at the time when NCDs were still sort of on the back burner. So we worked a lot with them, changing guidelines to allow clinical officers, for instance, to treat patients. The slums are under the jurisdiction of Nairobi City Council, so we had to work with them at that time. And then the local private health facilities, of course, community leaders to help us with sensitization, and then the community health workers who played a big part in the patient support groups, but also in the follow-ups and the door-to-door screening. So the big lesson that we learned really is that context matters, because ultimately the contextual factors seem to outweigh all our good intentions in terms of designing this particular intervention. And as I said earlier at the beginning, the contextual factor with regards to the fact that healthcare is out of pocket, but also the fact that people don't have too much choice with regards to where they can get affordable care. That was a big factor. So in the end, even the $4 proved a little bit much for some individuals. The $6 proved much for some individuals, but sometimes the individuals who are willing to continue contributing, a very small little family shock, like a family member falling sick, meant that month they didn't pay the subscription and therefore they were not eligible to receive care. So the context is a very strong factor. Of course, the other factor is, as I said earlier, in the terms of employment and livelihood opportunities in this population. So sometimes clinic days would happen, but the person would choose between going to the clinic or going to work where they're getting a daily wage. Because if you don't get your daily wage, then your family will go hungry. So at the end of the day, even the best designed intervention may run into problems because of the contextual factors, which perhaps played a very significant role at the population level. Of course, the other contextual matter is that when it comes to CVD risk reduction, it's not only about the medication that people can get because they have high blood pressure. There are other factors at play: alcohol use, tobacco use, healthy diet, salt consumption, and these are things which require policy level interventions. And yet our study was mostly focused on the healthcare delivery system. So in the end, this could have played a role also in what we observed, that there was not such a huge significant difference between the control and intervention sites. So these are some citations from the study. We've documented the model itself, so you can read more about it. And then, of course, the impact evaluation study, as well as the one that looked at outcomes and costs. So that's all I had. Thank you very much for listening. And I hope there will be time to answer your questions and have a discussion about our experience. Thank you very much.